welcome to the Emotional Balance Sheet Podcast, your guide to help you manage life, money, and multiples. Each episode, host Paul Fenner, Tama Capital's president and founder, and the proud parent of 4 amazing children, including 1 set of triplets, will provide insights on successfully sustaining an active lifestyle, career, and family through comprehensive wealth management strategies, financial education, and lifestyle planning, specific to parents raising twins, triplets, and more. Learn more, subscribe to the show, or connect with Paul at tamacapital.com.
This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be relied upon for investment decisions. Clients of TAMA may retain positions in the securities discussed in this podcast.
Have you ever looked into the mirror to give your future self the time it deserves? Hal Hershfield is a social psychologist whose research focuses on decision-making. As a professor of marketing and behavioral decision-making at UCLA's Anderson School of Management, he has an interdisciplinary approach to understanding how people make their decisions. In his new book, Your Future Self, Hal dives into the philosophy and psychology of how we perceive ourselves over time, identifying 3 common time travel mistakes and offering practical techniques to bring the future closer. We discuss the importance of considering our present and future decisions, taking small steps towards future goals, and avoiding overloading ourselves in the present. If we start thinking about investments of time rather than expenditures, maybe we'll start focusing on allocating time towards the things that are more closely linked to our long-term well-being. Please enjoy my conversation with Hal Hershfield. Professor Hal Hershfield, welcome to the Emotional Balance Sheet Podcast.
Hey, thanks, Paul. I'm really excited to be here.
You know, that was probably one of them. I probably need to start recording the conversation as soon as I get people on the Zoom or whatever, because we had such an interesting conversation before we hit record, and I'm sure a lot of people would have really dug into that as well.
I love it.
So, Hal, why don't we start off by having you tell us a little bit about your background? I've come to know your work through the various publications that you've been in. I know that you're a professor at UCLA with Cassie Holmes, whose book for people that watch is behind me, Happier Hour. And I'm trying to remember how many years it's been I've been following your work, but it's a pleasure to have you on, and can't wait to dig into a lot of the topics that we're going to talk about, including your new book, Future Self, that's going to be coming out later this summer. So I'll let you take it from there.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. Yes. So my background is, like you said, I am a psychologist, social psychologist. So I can't actually, help you with any clinical, clinical issues. But my research focus is really on decision making and, how we can understand the decisions that people make and also help them make, quote unquote, better ones. Because of that focus, I sit at a business school. So, I'm a professor of marketing and behavioral decision-making here at UCLA's Anderson School of Management. I also have an appointment in the psychology department. None of this stuff is all that interesting to people outside of academia. But the reason I mention it is because, my focus is kind of interdisciplinary. When I try to understand how people make their decisions, it's not just from a business perspective, and it's not just from sort of a, pure basic science psychological perspective. It's kind of a mix of a number of different disciplines.
You saw me, I had that big smile because this has been at the heart of my practice. Everybody knows I'm a financial advisor. I have my own firm, Tama Capital, named after my family. But a lot of my focus over the last 2 to 3 years has been the same thing, this molding of the emotional side of financial planning with the financial side of financial planning. And I think most people have this stereotypical idea of what an advisor is, like, oh, that's just a guy or gal that picks stocks or crunches numbers. And it's anything but what I do. Like, foundationally, those things are important, like portfolio management, tax prep, tax planning, but it's really the emotional side and the planning that's where the value is. So I like the way you're describing that, I'm like, yeah, that's exactly aligned to a lot of the points that I make.
You're so right about that. The financial advisory space in particular is one where I think we've seen a real shift toward paying attention to, like you said, it's not just the balance sheet, the financial balance sheet, if you will. It's the whole package. And I think any, top-notch advisor's got to be paying attention to that right now, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So otherwise, you're missing something.
Exactly. And like we were talking about before we hit record is, my focus is on working with families, parents that have like multiple kids, whether you have, 2 or 3 or 4 twins, multiples, or triplets like I do. It doesn't matter because those emotional strings are constantly pulling at you. You can't necessarily separate your emotional or personal life from your financial. They are so intertwined. And that's one of the reasons why I think I've gravitated to the work that you do and others like you, is that this focus on helping people make better decisions, especially like where your work centers on, and we're going to get into this, is like the long term. Like, how can you look at your future self today and make a better decision rather than kind of like kicking the can down the road?
That's exactly right. I'll say a couple of things there. So there's, like you said, there is a real difficulty in trying to separate out the different aspects of our lives, right? And so I think, for a long period of time, there's always this focus on balance, balance between your work life and your professional. Yeah, same. And, and it's like, it's not that, because I think it creates this false impression that you can do that, you can do it all and balance it. And it's, it's really more about sort of recognizing where the different pieces fit, and, what gets prioritized and when, right? Because I think there's fluidity, there's shifting around of the different sort of aspects of our lives, if you will. And you're absolutely right. I think that does feed into, the way that we make decisions now that impact us now and later, right? And so that's so much of my work is on how people make decisions that have a consequence now and later. Psychologists call this intertemporal choice, but any non-academic can say, a lot of the choices we make will affect us right now, and then also down the line, right? And so if we sort of ignore those big decisions or don't think through them fully, we may be fine with the now, but then sort of regret things later, right? And so I know I'm talking about abstractly and we can get concrete, but that's kind of that's the sort of push and pull that I'm really interested in.
Yeah, I think to just play off of that point you just made, I think I'm starting to use the word harmonize. Like I said, I hate the word balance, because there are points in time where your career is going to be really demanding, and you're going to have to give it more time than necessarily what you are giving your family, and vice versa. There's going to be times when your spouse or partner or kids are going to need you a whole heck of a lot more than your job. And so, that teeter-totter, it's never in balance. It's never just, parallel. It's up and down. And how you adjust to that, I think, is what helps create, a meaningful or sustainable or satisfying life. But I think it helps knowing that dynamics, it can maybe just help keep you sane.
Yeah, I think you're totally right. And I love that sort of analogy of harmonizing or description of harmonizing, whatever that is, because you're absolutely right. And I think you can go even deeper with it, right? Because if you're thinking about actual music, if one of the instruments or one of the singers is sort of constantly at the top, it's dominating, then there's no more harmony, and it's no longer a duet, or it's no longer whatever it is, a symphony. It's just a solo. And so I think, you sort of play that out, and you think about that in work and professional life, or current self and future self. If one is always taking priority, then you're right. Then the sort of the other things sort of end up being less paid attention to. You had mentioned in our pre-chat, we talked about Cassie McGoldner Holmes's book, Happier Hour, and she does a fantastic job talking about, some of these ideas of sort of like thinking through what happens, what we need to attend to now, and what things need to be sort of set aside and then revisited later.
So if we can move like into like a little bit deeper, like into your research on decision making, how do people perceive the passage of time, and how do these perceptions influence the decision making and our consumer behavior? That question kind of ties back into what you were just talking about as far as like the work that you do on decision making.
Yeah, so a lot of the work that I do on decision making really starts with the question of who are we deciding for? So in other words, I was mentioning earlier these sort of now and later trade-offs. And if you think about any of these sorts of decisions, so do I get a more expensive car or less? Do I take out a bigger mortgage or a smaller one? Do I move to a more expensive city? These sorts of, bigger questions. If we consider the fact that all of those decisions do impact us through time, then it helps to understand how people think about time and think about themselves through time, right? And so some of the work that I've done really examines the relationships and feelings that people have with and about their future selves. And I'm sort of drastically oversimplifying this, but the gist is that the more of a sense of connection, the more of a sense of close relationship that people have with their future selves, the more likely they're going to be to do things now that will put them in a better position later on. I'm happy to elaborate, but I wanted to just stop there for a second.
Yeah, I was just going to say that. Can you elaborate on that? Can you give like maybe like an example of that, or like what that means?
Right. So it's kind of an abstract question, right? And I think even saying that we have a relationship with our future self, that sounds sort of weird, right? Our future self isn't, is kind of just in our mind's eye at the moment, like they never really exist until they do, but then it's our present self. So, you can have these sort of mind-bending conversations really quickly, but if you take it back a second, think about your future self like you think about any other person in your life. You are, you and I don't know each other well, but I'm going to make a guess that you have a lot of different people in your life, from, the closest ones, your kids, your spouse, maybe, other family members, to, folks that are like, close friends, to, all the way down to the person that you see occasionally at the grocery store, or maybe there's somebody that works in your office and you walk by them, but you don't really know them that well. Those are all the different relationships we have. And you'll notice that they vary in degrees of closeness, from very, very close to not that close at all. And what my work has tried to uncover is whether or not we can experience those same degrees of closeness or not with our future selves. And what I've been finding is that people who think of their future selves more like we think about our kids and our spouses and our elderly parents and our best friends. In other words, those are other people to us, but they're people we really care about. If we take that sort of lens and that sort of approach to considering our future selves, then we're going to be more likely to do things like get up and exercise, or try to eat healthier, or maybe even opt for the more ethical decision if faced with an unethical path, right? Or at least that's what my and other colleagues and students' research has been showing.
So two points on that, or two kind of follow-up questions is, one is, does that conversation you have with your future self, does it get more vivid as we get older? So full disclosure, I'm 47 and I'm thinking a lot more about this now. And I think it's because of getting older. And then two is, if there's one benefit of having kids, I'm sure there's a lot. I shouldn't have phrased it that way. But is every year is a transition with them. Like this year, my triplets went from elementary school to middle school. And so with that, like every stage of parenting in my life is directly tied to them. And I think differently about it. Like that, my future self, like, okay, well, they only have 7 more years or so until they graduate from high school. What the heck is that going to be like? What is it going to be like when they get to high school? Like, and so I think about that. And so I wonder like how kids or age is attached to that. So that's question one. But then my other question is like, and I know I've read this and you've been quoted on this, is saying that the deeper relationship that we have with our future self can lead to a more happier or satisfying life. And that really got my attention. So I'd love to have you elaborate on that. So maybe take that first question about age and parenting first, and then that second one second.
So your first question is a great one, and your intuition is spot on. One of the things we know is that as people get older, they feel...
And I'll just say this. My wife, Teresa, she'll have a milestone birthday next year. We just won't talk about what that milestone number is.
30. That's great.
I married young.
Yeah, very young. So, your intuition about the link between age and the closeness we feel with our future selves is exactly right. As people get older, they do in fact feel a higher degree of similarity and overlap with their future selves. Now, I haven't really defined what I mean by future self. Now, normally when we ask people in research surveys, we're asking them to think 5 years out, 10 years out, et cetera. But it could really be any period of time. What matters here is, in terms of the self we're thinking about, is what's the relevant context. If I'm thinking about retirement, the future self I'm considering is probably, about 30, between 25 and 30 years older than I am now, right? Or maybe a little less. Well, we'll see. As we get older, we do experience more of a connection to our future selves. And, I suspect for a number of reasons. One is that life becomes a little bit more stable and certain as we get older. Of course, there's still uncertainty and instability sort of around us. But, if you do some of the like normative adult milestones of, getting married and settling down and having a career, these sorts of things, they kind of lock you into futures that are more laid out, right? I mean, you can always change, but it's hard for people to do that. And we typically don't do that as much. But you raised another point too, which is that as we're getting older, especially as, if you're a parent, you start viewing the world, of course, through the milestones that your kids are going through as well, right? And, boy, if there's anything to make you realize how fast time moves by, it's seeing how quickly
definitely
they go from, being able to carry them like a football to, oh my gosh, we're going to think about being an empty nester, right? Now, I don't have any great data looking at, are parents different than non-parents on this dimension? It's a really hard question to ask because the decision, if you're so lucky to become a parent, right, that decision may be associated with all sorts of other factors as well. Like maybe you're already someone who thinks about the future, maybe not. There's all sorts of questions there. But suffice it to say, it's a really interesting research question. I'll just add one other thing before we get to your second question there, which is that milestone birthdays are also pretty. You sort of jokingly mentioned that about your wife, right? But I actually have some research with Adam Alter at NYU where we've investigated what happens when people approach these milestone birthdays. In other words, that's like a pretty salient marker of moving through time, and it's also kind of a salient marker of becoming like a new future self. Now I'm in my 40s. Now I'm going to be my 50s, et cetera. And so, one of the things that we've found is that when people approach milestone markers, they start to do kind of a audit. I'll call it like a meaning audit of their lives. Am I doing the things now that make my life as meaningful as I want it to be, right? And that question can result in variety of different answers from, no to, and having a mini crisis to like, no, I want to do more to yes, things are going really well and I want to continue them. It's why, by the way, you see more people sign up for a marathon right before
those milestones.
Yeah. Okay. Now, would you just kind of reiterate rephrase the second question again so I can get it right?
Yeah. So the follow-up to that was I've read your research and I know you've been quoted in saying this, is that, the deeper connection that we can make to our future self, the happier or more satisfying our lives can become. And I'm wondering, like, what is the root behind that? How does that work?
Yeah. And so this is, I think, we just need to be careful here because, some of these questions are correlational and some are causal, right? And so in research that I've done with Joey Reif and Jordi Quadbach, we've found that people who feel more of a sense of similarity with their future selves end up being more satisfied with their lives 10 years later. So I'll give you the very quick overview of that. At one period of time, people are asked how similar they think they'll be to their future selves. 10 years later, researchers go back and ask these folks, how satisfied are you? The people who said that they perceived more similarity end up being more satisfied with their lives. Now, we can't say for sure it's because of that, right? Because, there's a number of different things going on. But what we suspect is that if you do feel this degree of overlap and similarity, you're more likely to do things that put yourself in a good position later on. And that possibly can be related to these measures of well-being. It's still kind of an open question as to this sort of direct link there. Another angle there, another aspect that I think is going on is that people who feel more of this overlap, this similarity, may also know themselves a little bit better too. So I can think ahead 10 years and say, let me think of the positive and negative aspects of my personality. On the negative side, like I know I get a little anxious, I get a little neurotic about things. I don't really think that's going to change. And I think I'd be fooling myself if I told you that in 10 years, come back to me and I'm going to be like super chill. So I don't think I'll be disappointed when 10 years from now, I'm pretty similar to who I am in some of those ways. I also might perceive some positive change in other aspects of my life. I really value, getting to know my students, this is kind of a relatively surface level example. I think maybe I can do even better at that moving forward. And so you say that similarities, well, there's a change there, but weirdly, when people think about positive changes, they think about themselves becoming more of who they are, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Like this whole these whole points you're making, I'm just like my mind's like running a million miles an hour. I'm like, wow, this is really fascinating because I think about one thing that's been constantly on my mind with my coach that I've been working with, Matt Reiner, is like I always keep stressing to Matt, I'm like, because he's always like, you're trying to do too much at one point in time or at once, and I'm like, well, it kind of goes back to like the day that I started Tama Capital was the day my triplets were born. It's like that's like insane. But I think back to that, I'm like, if I wouldn't have taken that first step, I would have now 12 years later, so it kind of fits into that nice 10-year period that you kept referencing, I would not be where I'm at today. And so I'm always thinking, and because of that, I think I'm constantly thinking what can I start today that, and this is going back to some of Dan Pink's work, that I won't regret not doing a year from now, 2 years from now, 3 years from now.
Yeah, I think it's a really, really important perspective. And it's really difficult, right? Because we have so many pulls on our attention and our time and our energy. And to then add in a layer and say, not only should you be thinking about the decisions you're making right now, but now jump ahead and think about looking backward. How would you feel if you did this thing or didn't do this thing? And I think, your example about, the one step and the next step is a great example, because you sort of can't get to the bigger accomplishments unless you take those like little smaller steps along the way. There's some really fascinating research by Peter Gollwitzer and Gabrielle Oettingen. They each talk about this in slightly different ways, but about mental contrasting, where we say, let's talk about where I am now versus where I want to be in the future, and about what are the big obstacles that stand between now and then, and which of them are overcomable. So what little things, to back to your point, what little things can I do right now to get to that, bigger, or that better position later on? And I'll just add in one other aspect here, which is that, you said there's sort of like a negative consequence of this type of thinking, which is doing too much right now, right? Because even if I say, well, I want to take this one little step so I don't regret it later, there might be 10 other spaces in my life where I have that same thinking. And then you are going to be in that situation where you say, I don't have any time. What am I doing? And, in the book, one of the things I do talk about is one instance where we kind of screw over our future selves is by saying yes too much to things that we'll later regret.
Yeah, I agree. And that's where it comes back to, let's not use the word balance, because that word kind of stinks. Harmony. Because I know, like Teresa, like when our kids were really little, obviously, I was working a full-time corporate career plus launching TAMA at the same time. And so I was working like literally like 60, 70-hour weeks. And you talk about some of that regret coming back and saying yes too much, is that, I look back and I try really hard to remember like what it was like, holding them or rocking them to sleep or, feeding them. And those memories, thinking back into the Walt Disney movie, the emotion one. God, now I can't think of the name of it.
Up? No,
not Up. I'm thinking like core memories, but
yes,
I can't think of.
Right. I know which one you're talking about too, and I'm forgetting the name too because I'm thinking about it directly. Yeah, exactly.
But no, Up is a great movie too. That's actually one of my favorite movies, Disney movies. Because Teresa is a Disney. We'll just call her a Disney fanatic. But it's sometimes hard because to remember those times, because I was working so much. And then we had, like any parent that has multiples, it's just different because it's it's just like an organized chaos. If at best, it's a machine line, feeding and diaper changes. And, it really wasn't until like we had our plus one, Mackenzie, that Teresa and I both realized, crap, we missed a lot with those triplets because you're holding one and there's two other ones and you feel guilty. And it's like, looking back at it, I know that we made the best decisions that we could. And again, tying that back to what I was talking about, doing something today that I won't regret in the future is like trying to make sure I'm having better relationships with my kids, especially my two boys.
I love this conversation because it's
not what you expected. So probably was it talking to a financial advisor?
No, it's great. It's perfect. But it's true. I mean, we have two kids. We don't have multiples, and even looking back to when our daughter was born, there's so much unknown. There's so much of an unknown there. So even looking back to when our daughter was born as our first kid, there's so much of an unknown, and we're so focused on getting things right that it's easy to kind of miss, those moments because you're so focused on like what am I getting wrong here, and I can only imagine how that's exacerbated and intensified when you've got three that you're dealing with there, right? And And at the same time, I really love the perspective of like, you got to look back at some points and for some different things and say, I did the best that I could. And if your answer is, well, I didn't, well, and as you said, Dan Pink has some great, um, uh, perspectives on this in his latest book. Well, then let me use that regret to sort of power me forward and figure out what I can do and change now.
So if I pivot to coming back to touching on one thing from a financial standpoint is, I know a lot of the work that in research that you do, again, going way back to when we first started this conversation, this pull between emotional and financial is like the research on increasing saving behavior through this age rendering process, if you will, of your future self. Talk to us about that work, because if I get it right, the research shows like if you show a picture of yourself when you're 70, you may save more today when you're 40 or 50. Is that right?
Yeah, that's the gist. So I mean, the bigger picture here is that it can be really hard to connect with our future selves. And one thing that I and my collaborators have done to try to sort of aid people along, and we call it, Dan Goldstein, my collaborator, called an imagination aid, is give them an image of what they'll look like in the future. Now, when we first started doing this, it was like we had to work with like a graphic designer, and we had to do all sorts of like, of our own work. And now it's like super easy, right? On Snapchat, you can just like press a button and you like, boom, there you are, well into the future. We've done this in sort of like, quote unquote, hypothetical situations where people can make intentions about saving. And we've done it in settings where people can make a real decision about their savings accounts. What we're generally finding is that, exposure to these images kind of helps push us forward to think more vividly about our future selves so that we do something for them. The one thing I want to note is that, it's not like this perfect, magic bullet where like, okay, like, let's just like look at older Paul and you'll be like all set and, suddenly find yourself saving and not spending, right? It's like,
right.
It's, any of these decisions that I've studied, these, sort of big, as I said, intertemporal decisions, have multiple inputs into them.
There's never just one thing. There's never like one silver bullet.
Exactly. And there's never just one influence on our decisions, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's like you may have your own childhood experiences with money and the way that you saw your parents spend it, and your spouse might have theirs. And, and then you may have 1 or 10 kids, or, there's all different factors that are going to impact how you approach these sorts of decisions with money, but also with, these other sort of domains that are relevant too. My sort of approach has been that seeing our future self and trying to interact with it is one, tool in our arsenal that we can use to try to do things a little bit better by those future selves, for those future selves.
Yeah, I think you made a really good point there, because being an advisor, like I deal with that all the time. And a good example I use often, because it comes up over and over and over again between parents or partners, is like, what do we do for college for our kids? Because usually like, I have a family that, the dad worked his way through college, didn't get any help from mom and dad. The spouse, wife's partner, they were lucky, mom and dad saved, they put them through college debt free. And so they come at it at completely different angles. And here I am being the one, that independent third party arbitrator, trying to strike this, the right chord, if you will, between, okay, how are we going to move forward? Because one wants it, not to, pay for anything or save anything. And the other one's like, well, I want to do whatever we can to make sure they don't have debt.
Yeah. And I think that is such an important part of the conversation, especially with, especially the conversations you're having in your business, because these big financial decisions and other types of decisions are, are relationship decisions too, right? And if you well, I love what you said. I forgot you said it. I don't know if you're the arbitrator or the mediator or the whatever you are. You play an important role in that, because sometimes being in that sort of like more like emotionally dialed down context can really help with decisions that can otherwise be quite emotional.
Right. Yeah. Just checking on time. Because I could keep going, but I know I only have you for a finite period of time. So there's two things I want to get to. One is the book, Your Future Self. It's going to come out in June, correct?
Yeah, June 6th. That's right.
Okay. Can you walk us through maybe a couple points that you would want people to take away from reading the book?
Yeah, sure. So, the book that I've written, Your Future Self, How to Make Tomorrow Better Today. In the book, it's really all about trying to understand why we sometimes screw over our future selves and how we can do better for them. But I start by really trying to figure out, from almost a philosophical and psychological perspective, who are we over time and how do we think about ourselves over time? And, I hesitate to sort of get deep into philosophy and psychology because sometimes that stuff is hard to grapple with, but I try to make the conversation really fun, and there's thought experiments and stories in there, because if we can understand something about how we treat ourselves and see ourselves moving through time, then it makes it easier to now understand why do we sometimes mess up and how we can do better. And so in the sort of second section of the book, I talk about what I call time travel mistakes. And I don't mean that in the DeLorean, Back to the Future type of way, but as in mental time travel, how we sort of zoom back and forth through time in our minds. And I talk about three mistakes there. One is that we get overly anchored on the present. I call it missing our flight. We sort of, pay too much attention right now and all of a sudden realize that we haven't really considered the future. Another one is, what I call poor trip planning, where we sort of think ahead to the future, but we do it in a really impoverished way. We're just not thinking about it all that deeply. And a classic example of that is procrastination. And then, in the sort of third error I call it, or a mistake I call it, packing the wrong clothes, where we convinced ourselves we're thinking about the future, but we're really using the present way too much to think ahead, and we're not really appreciating the fact that the present and the future can be different. And then in the last section of the book, I got practical and say, okay, well, what can we do about it? And here I talk about some of these techniques that we might use to try to bring the future closer and to try to stay on the right course when we have these difficult decisions. And then on the flip side, how we can make the present sacrifices that we are making feel easier so that we can ultimately celebrate it in a way that really appreciates both the present and the future. Of course, you'll have to buy the book to learn more, but I'm just kidding. But yeah,
no, it's we've had. I'm really fortunate. I must have pretty good persuasion, because I know that your book at some point here in the near future, when it gets out, will probably hit the New York Times best-selling list. And we've had quite a run of New York Times bestseller authors on the show, and I can't wait to add yours to the bookshelf behind me. So
that's awesome. Well, Paul, I would of course love that, but keep my fingers crossed.
Well, I'll get to my final question that I ask all my guests, obviously the parents, is what is the best thing about being a parent?
Yeah. That you get to watch movies like Inside Out. There it is.
Inside Out, yes.
Okay, no, that's not my answer. All right, it's such a hard question because like so many of the things we've been talking about, there's many of these things there is no one thing, right? But for me personally, kids have totally changed my definition of what it means to be happy. And this is actually something I talk about in the book. I had a mentor, Yakov Trope. He's a professor at NYU. I ran into him when my wife was pregnant. I said, I'm excited, but I'm also a little anxious. I don't know what life is going to be, because, there's this whole debate in the literature about, kids, they make you less satisfied with your life and you're less happy and all this stuff. And he said, you're thinking about happiness the wrong way. That suggests that happiness is one color. And, with kids, it's this multicolored beast. And I think that is, it makes so much sense, because it's not that there's a weekend where I say that was a great weekend or that was a bad weekend. There's moments that are amazing and there's moments that are frustrating. And I think kids have really added so much color, to my own life in terms of the meaning and the happiness I experience.
Well, that's the thing. And I probably say this at the end of every episode, but I love that question, because I've been doing the podcast now for over 2.5 years, and everybody has a completely different answer. And especially yours to come at it with color, because I'm colorblind. I'm just thinking like this rainbow of color, but I totally can relate and understand, because like you like within one day, there's so many seasonal changes with these kids. Like
yes.
One minute you're loving on them, then the next minute you're like ready to like hunt them.
I'm so
out
frustrated.
of the house.
Yes, exactly.
Well, Professor Hal Hershfield, thank you so much for being on the Emotional Balance Sheet podcast. I know that I'm going to see you here in another month with Carl Richards, but I look forward to many more conversations to come and a much deeper relationship.
Hey, thanks, Paul. It was so great to be here. I appreciate all your questions.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Emotional Balance Sheet podcast. Please visit tamacapital.com to subscribe to this podcast, or to connect with certified financial planner and registered investment advisor Paul Fenner of Tama Capital. And please join us again next time on the Emotional Balance Sheet podcast.